The criminality you have admitted may be called an unrestrained campaign of rape and abuse of women. It could be described as the work of a serial rapist, but it may not be possible to encapsulate succinctly the broad devastation you have caused through sexual violence and exploitation, all the time carrying the unique and defining office of a police constable. Various guidelines drafted by the Sentencing Council are relevant to individual offences, and some of the overarching guidelines also apply, including the domestic abuse guideline. But it is not necessary for me to set out their contents in detail in these sentencing remarks, because the gravity of all subsidiary offending can be reflected fairly in the overall sentences for rape. Generally, throughout, there is high culpability and greater harm. The guideline for rape provides that sentences above 20 years imprisonment are appropriate for a campaign of rape. The prosecution submits that such sentences would be appropriate in the individual cases of at least 5 of your victims. The maximum sentence is life imprisonment. Apart from the guilty pleas, there is no material mitigation beyond your lack of previous convictions. I have to bear in mind that the total sentence must be just and proportionate, which means in this case that it is not right to simply add together all the sentences likely to have been passed for individual counts and impose the total. That would lead to a wholly disproportionate outcome. The defence have not served or relied on any psychiatric or psychological report on you. In order that the court had an independent professional assessment of you, I ordered a pre-sentence report. You described childhood trauma to the probation officer, which must have affected your personality. You grew up with parents who drank to excess and neglected you. When they separated, you became the target of abuse by a stepfather in your teens. Like any child, you should have been nurtured and taught moral strength, and you were not. As an adult, you abused alcohol yourself, although you were able and careful not to do so when working. This indicates that you were able to control yourself when you chose to. There is no mental health issue beyond the inevitable depressive impact of custody. A less credible part of your account to the probation officer is your claim that you are unable to recall your acts of sexual violence and degradation towards women. I have to conclude that this is minimisation because you are yet unable to face the enormity of the abhorrent acts you did while a serving police officer. The principal aggravating feature common to all the offences I'm dealing with is your use and abuse of the role of a police officer. All the victims were aware of your occupation and affected by it. Some of them you specifically reassured, tricked or intimidated, abusing the trust that the public vest in police officers. Furthermore, the sheer number of offences of rape is relevant to assessing overall criminality, and the domestic context in some of the counts represents a violation of the trust and security that normally exists between people in an intimate setting. Other aggravating features of particular offences include repeated violent rapes, including when women are unwell, ejaculation, false imprisonment to facilitate the commission of sexual offences, use of an imitation firearm, a police baton and a whip to assault and threaten.
And we're going to step away from some of the more violent and gruesome details from Mrs Justice Chima Grubb's sentencing of Metropolitan Police Officer, former Metropolitan Police Officer David Carrick. She talked there in the sentencing about the malign influence of men like him, how she said it stands in the way of improving women's dignity, using the line "courage calls to courage everywhere," which was the rallying cry of the suffragettes, talking about the fact that he prevented these women coming forward because they did not think that they would be believed because he was a police officer.
Reduction in sentence for a guilty plea applies in your case by Section 73 of the Sentencing Code 2020. The court must take into account the stage at which you indicated your intention to plead guilty and the circumstances in which that indication was given. A sliding scale is applied. You denied all the crimes you were interviewed about. Until the admissions by way of guilty pleas, there was no acknowledgement on your part that the accusations made against you were true, and the police and complainants prepared for a trial. This case has been opened by the prosecution on a full facts basis. I would have allowed a reduction of 15% in sentence to allow for your guilty pleas to the majority of the charges which were entered in December 2022, with a trial date of the 6th of February 2023, having been fixed some months earlier. In respect of the earliest charges, those on the separate indictment on which you were arraigned only in December 2022, you indicated swiftly that you did not contest them, except count 7, which has been left on file, and you pleaded guilty in January 2023. I would have allowed 1/3 reduction. In reaching a conclusion on the correct level of credit for your guilty pleas, I have recognised the impact of one particular feature. Between July 2022 and December 2022, you were removed.
And the judge now considering, when she makes her judgment on sentencing, the point that David Carrick pleaded or did not plead guilty. She said that initially he said that he denied any of the offences or that the woman had consented for a year between December 2021 and December 2022. He said he pleaded not guilty, and it was only just in the last couple of months, in December and January 22 to 23, that he did plead guilty. But she says you have not expressed remorse or regret, and in fact unable to recall some of the offences. She says you are unable to face the enormity of what you did.
Or consensual. You were removed to Rampton on the 22nd of July for assessment and treatment. Thereafter, your lawyers had limited, if any, contact with you or news about you. It was only after the court intervened, seeking an update in your treatment, that on the 16th and 18th of November, the consultant psychiatrist responsible for you at Rampton Hospital provided a conclusion. This was that you were not suffering from any mental disorder requiring treatment in hospital, and you would be returned to Her Majesty's Prison Belmarsh when arrangements could be made for you to be kept under 24-hour surveillance to protect your life from another attempt at your own hand. Those representing you informed the prosecution and court swiftly after your return to prison that you would be pleading guilty. In the meantime, as I have indicated, the victim T on the separate indictment had come forward, and so further offences were laid against you. And as I've said, you changed your pleas to guilty in January 2023. In all the circumstances, I will allow 20% guilty plea reduction in the notional determinate sentence that would otherwise have been appropriate. I conclude from all the circumstances and information before me that you were driven to try to commit suicide as a self-pitying reaction to the shame wrought on you by these proceedings, rather than from remorse. The starting point, it is agreed between the parties, is an assessment of dangerousness. Section 308, subsection 2 of the Sentencing Code, introduced by the Sentencing Act 2020, provides that where a court has to assess whether there is a significant risk to members of the public of serious harm occasioned by the commission by the offender of further specified offences, the court must take into account all the information available to it about the nature and circumstances of the offence, may take into account all the information that is available to it about the nature and circumstances of any other offence of which the offender has been convicted, may take into account any information before it about any pattern of behaviour of which any of the offences above forms a part, and may take into account any information about the offender which is before it. Serious harm is defined by Section 306, subsection 2, as death or serious personal injury, whether physical or psychological. This predictive assessment must be made as at the date of sentencing and on the premise that the offender is not in custody. The author of the pre-sentence report concludes that you pose a high risk of causing serious sexual and physical harm to the public and presently to yourself. I am sure the test is satisfied because of the persistence of your commission of serious sexual offences, particularly rapes, against so many victims over such a long period of time, which has already led to serious harm. I am sure that you present a grave danger to women who might be persuaded to be alone with you in intimate situations, and this danger will last indefinitely. I've considered guidance from Lord Thomas, the Chief Justice, in the Crown and Verinskas. I have to consider what form of sentence should follow this determination. Section 285 of the Sentencing Code applies to those offences you committed after the 4th of April 2005, which comprise the majority. I consider that the seriousness of the offences which I have to sentence you is such as to justify the imposition as a last resort of a sentence of imprisonment for life. Indeed, only such a sentence will meet the gravity of the offending I have to deal with you for, in combination with the risk you pose. Similarly, for the 5 offences of rape which fall out with the Sentencing Code scheme, I am satisfied that life sentences are required to meet the gravity of the offending and the risk you will continue to pose. I have assessed very carefully whether, given your abusive position, this case should attract a whole life order. The rare sentence of last resort is a life sentence with a whole life tariff. In the Crown and McCann, Sinaga and Shah 2020 EWCA Crim 1676, the Court of Appeal Criminal Division examined conjoined cases involving serious sexual offending on a scale of extreme gravity. Although life sentences with minimum terms to be served of 40 years were appropriate after a trial, none of those cases reached the threshold for a whole life tariff in the view of the court. None of those offenders was a policeman, and the court did not have drawn to their attention any potential scenario close to the one presented to this court. However, the prosecution specifically does not seek to persuade me that your offending fits the description of, quotes, wholly exceptional circumstances, which the court indicated would justify such an order. I've also scrutinised the judgment of the court in another recent conjoined case, the Crown and Stewart, Cousins, Tustin and Hughes, 2022 EWCA Crim 1063, in which the offender Cousins appealed against the whole life order imposed on him, following a notorious abduction of a young woman from the streets of London, accomplished while he was an off-duty police officer by use of his warrant card, followed by her rape and murder. The court accepted that police officers are in a uniquely powerful position. In respect of the fixing of minimum terms where a mandatory life sentence is required by law, as set out in Schedule 21 of the Sentencing Code, a different scheme to the one I have to apply, Lord Burnett, Chief Justice, stated the principle, quote, in our view, the correct approach is to focus on the facts, which in a rare case might lead to the conclusion that a whole life order is appropriate, close quote. At paragraph 83, having explained the correct route to a whole life order in that case, he continued, quote, this was, as the judge said, warped, selfish and brutal offending which was both sexual and homicidal. It was a case with unique and extreme aggravating features. Chief amongst these, as the judge correctly identified, was the grotesque misuse by Cousins of his position as a police officer with all that connoted to facilitate Miss Everard's kidnap, rape and murder. We agree with the observations of the judge about the unique position of the police, the critical importance of their role and the critical trust the public repose in them. End of quote. Had the court in McCann imagined the facts of this case, would they have equated it to the gravity of the near-miss mass murder attempt or the foiled terrorist atrocity, which the court considered would compel a court to attach a whole life tariff to a discretionary life sentence? The standout feature is the element of abuse of the status of a police constable. But having considered the matter with care, I've come to the same conclusion as the prosecution. Of the utmost gravity though this is, the wholly exceptional circumstances test is not met. Thus, the imposition of a discretionary life sentence without a whole life tariff must be accompanied by an evaluation of the notional determinate term that would have been required to mark the gravity of the total offending had a life sentence not been imposed. That term provides the start of the calculation required to reach a minimum term an offender must serve. It must be for the shortest term that is commensurate with the seriousness of the offences before the court. Mr. Williamson, King's Counsel, in his succinct and well-focused mitigation, submits that the criminality before this court does not reach the extreme limits found in the cases of the offenders McCann and Sinaga. I do not agree. Your offending was over 17 years and encompassed 12 victims. Moreover, the singular element which elevates your offending as a brutal serial rapist into that company is the principal aggravating feature of the explicit or implicit use of your occupation to entice, reassure, or intimidate your victims. You have to bear in mind that my function is to impose appropriate punishment, and when that is served, the parole board will decide how to protect the public thereafter. Decades will have passed before that time comes. I conclude that the notional determinate sentence that would provide a just and proportionate punishment is 60 years. To that guilty plea, a discount of 20% will be applied. It is to your credit that you did not contest a trial. Your decision deserves this recognition because there is no doubt that a court hearing at which evidence is given and challenged provides a particular ordeal for victims. From the resulting term of 48 years, I have to set 2/3 minus the time spent so far in custody, which is 491 days. Stand up, David Carrick. I've made ancillary orders for deprivation pursuant to Section 153 of the Sentencing Act 2020 and restraining orders under Sections 359 and 360 of the Act. They will remain in force until further order. The victim surcharge applies. I make no sexual harm prevention orders given the nature of the sentence I am about to pass. On the main indictment on counts 16, 19, 29, 30, 31, 32, 38, 39, 42 and 43, the sentence is 4 years imprisonment on each concurrent. On counts 24 and 25, the sentence is 7 years on each concurrent. On count 6, on the second indictment, I impose a concurrent determinate sentence of 9 years. 31 sentences of life imprisonment are imposed on the main indictment on counts 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15, 17, 18, 20, 21, 22, 23, 26, 27, 28, 33, 34, 35, 36, 37, 40 and 41. Also, 5 life sentences are imposed on the second indictment on counts 1, 2, 3, 4 and 5. This makes a total of 36 life sentences. The minimum term you will have to serve before the parole board can think of releasing you is 30 years, 239 days. And you may go down. Mr Little, Mr Williamson, the court salutes the courage of all the victims and their families, and I hope they're able to thrive in the rest of their lives. The teams of police officers concerned have worked hard to bring this case to court and to keep the confidence of the victims. To do so under the fierce scrutiny this case has attracted is promising for the future. The Crown Prosecution Service lawyers and counsel have met tight deadlines set by the court and put the case together fairly and effectively. The defence team has met the challenge of dealing with an evolving set of grave allegations and a completely disorientated client with patience and professionalism. The court wishes to recognise that work and to thank all of you.
Well, Mrs Justice Chima Grubb there, handing down a sentence of 30 years, 239 days before David Carrick can be considered for parole. She looked at his position in society. She said that it was her role to enforce punishment, but it's up to the parole board to decide when he will actually be released. 17 years of offending, 12 victims in total, and the explicit and implicit use of his occupation an aggravating factor when she was considering that sentencing. She said that you present a great danger to women and that danger will remain indefinitely, but not given a whole life order because she said that it was not wholly exceptional circumstances. It was quite striking when we heard the number of those offences being read through, numbered one by one at the end. It gives you some real grasp of the number of offences that this man carried out. These, though, a flavour of some of them, but the brutality that he brought to bear on his victims, and those victims being paid tribute to at the end there by the Justice, saying that she salutes them and their families and hopes that they are now able to thrive. Well, our crime correspondent Martin Brunt is at Southwark Crown Court. A substantial sentence, which we thought it would be, Martin, given the severity of what he did over so many years to so many women.
Yes, I think perhaps not as high as some people had anticipated. I think some people, and including me, thought he might get something like 35 years, but maybe 30, 35 essentially doesn't make a great deal of difference at this stage. She said at one point, the judge, that she was giving him a 20% reduction for his guilty pleas, although she talked about his shame rather than his remorse. She didn't pull her punches. She said that he'd had a spectacular downfall for a man charged with upholding the law and empowered to do so, even to the extent of being authorised to carry a gun. And that really was one of the main themes of her sentencing remarks, that he had abused his power as a police officer to entice, reassure or intimidate his victims. And I think that was always going to be the case, although police officers are often given compounded sentences where they commit crimes on duty. None of his crimes were committed on duty, but very clearly and obviously to the judge, he used his status as a police officer to help him commit those crimes. And we heard from a number of victims, didn't we, yesterday, who said that they were encouraged to meet him because he was a police officer, telling some of them that they would be safe with him because he was a police officer, and then threatening them with, in one case, a gun. Perhaps it was a replica gun, nobody can be sure, but showing his warrant card to others, and then to many of his victims telling them that because he was a police officer, if they ever did complain to the authorities about his attacks on them, their word would not be believed over his.
And Martin, we're expecting to hear from the police and also the Crown Prosecution Service.
Yes, we're going to hear, I think, immediately hear from the officers who finally investigated Carrick. Now, these are officers from the Hertfordshire Police Force who worked also with Bedfordshire and Cambridgeshire police forces, and those three were involved because the victims largely came from that part of the world. But we're probably going to hear from the senior officer involved in the investigation. I don't know that we're going to hear from the Metropolitan Police at this stage. They weren't involved directly in the investigation, and we did hear from them yesterday. Another in a long line of apologies from the Metropolitan Police for allowing Carrick to continue in his job, even when they did know that he had at least been accused of predatory behaviour over many years. So yes, we'll hear from the detective involved in this prosecution of Carrick, and we'll also hear from the Crown Prosecution Service, which of course played a big part in the formulating of the charges to which Carrick eventually was persuaded to plead guilty, persuaded by the wealth of evidence against him, the numbers of victims who had complained about him, and a very obvious pattern of behaviour over many years in which ultimately he was convinced that he couldn't argue, as he had originally on his arrest, that he either couldn't remember those crimes or those attacks, or he had only ever had sex with any of those women by their consent.
And Martin, what did you make of the tone of the sentencing? There was clear, I felt, sort of simmering anger, but behind a lot of what the judge was saying, where she talked about why some of the women had not come forward, how they felt that they wouldn't be believed. She said it spoke to the moral corruption of the way that victims are treated in society, and the fact that he had used his position was clearly an aggravating factor here.
Yeah, she talked about his malign influence. I didn't quite catch everything she said, but she talked about how that stood in the way of the revolution of women's dignity. So I'm sure we would have heard something similar from a male judge, but perhaps there's an added poignancy that we were hearing those words from a woman judge. I mean, she was very calm and collected in her delivery, as you would expect from a judge. But yes, I think perhaps we could read behind that she did have an awful lot of sympathy and empathy with those women, victims, from whom she had heard, if not directly, she'd heard their victim impact statements yesterday, when they went into dreadful detail about how they had lived in fear, they had suffered great physical pain, but also they'd been intimidated by Carrick into not reporting what he had done to them, and then subsequently had gone on to suffer in their own relationships. Their lives, their mental health had been damaged, and particularly one victim I spoke to yesterday, a fellow police officer of David Carrick, who said that she had lived ever since 2004, after he raped her, with her guilt for not reporting him at the time, but said, look, you know, maybe I had a greater responsibility to report him. I was a police officer, but I'm also a human being.
And Martin, we can hear loud voices behind you. There are a lot of people who are very angry about this case, aren't there? And a lot of people down there protesting against violence against women.
Have you got any live capability there? No.
Yes, this is a protest group that was here yesterday, been here today since about 9 o'clock, since before the hearing started. Essentially, making their voices heard about the issue, the whole issue of male violence, and holding this case up as a shining example of how men do go undetected when they are committing crimes against women. I mean, of course, many are caught and convicted, but they're holding up the case of David Carrick as somebody who was allowed to commit many offences, many terrible crimes against women, even though some of those offences were reported. There was a gathering of intelligence around this man, who was a police officer as well, a man, as the judge said, empowered to hold up the law. In spite of all that, he was allowed to continue for more than 20 years serving as a police officer.
And Martin, this has led to a spotlight on the police service, on the Metropolitan Police especially, and reforms within it.
Yes, I mean, it's early days, isn't it? But there really is a determination to change things. I have to say it's not the first time we've heard this, and certainly after the abduction, rape and murder of Sarah Everard by a serving Metropolitan Police officer, much the same concern was expressed by the Metropolitan Police. And it's perhaps sometimes difficult to see what exactly has changed, although, of course, Carrick's offences go back many years to 2002, to the first year that he'd served as a Metropolitan Police officer. But the commissioner, the newish commissioner, Sir Mark Rowley of the Metropolitan Police, has countless times since he got the job in September said that he is absolutely determined, in the wake of the Carrick case and others, of appalling bad behaviour by officers, to root out bad cops, to encourage other officers to inform on their colleagues who are exhibiting bad behaviour, bad language, committing crimes, and also examining the disciplinary process, which he says stops him sacking bad officers. But it's gone beyond the Met in the last few months, again in the wake of the Carrick case, because he was allowed to become a police officer even though there were unconvicted allegations or unpursued allegations against him. He was still given the job. He was then vetted again some years later. And although by then there was a mounting catalogue of allegations against him, he was still permitted to keep his job. So the whole question of vetting is one of the very big issues that not just the Met, but police forces throughout England and Wales, all 43 forces, are trying to get to grips with, and going through police databases to see if any of their officers over the years have been accused but not pursued over largely predatory behaviour or misogynistic activity. And there may well be a number of officers who will find themselves being investigated again, perhaps prosecuted, perhaps thrown out of their jobs. It really does seem as though there is certainly a collective determination within policing to get to grips with these problems. But cynics will say, we've heard it before, let's see what happens in the future.
And indeed, Mark Rowley said himself, didn't he, that we could see a number of people appearing in court every week in the future about this.
Yeah, he said that because of the efforts he's making to root out bad behaviour, he said we should expect 2 or 3 of his police officers to be appearing each week in court over coming weeks. But even he doesn't know the extent of the bad behaviour, corruption, criminal activity that he might uncover, given that he's going at it hammer and tongs. It may be that there are even more than he anticipates, but he's made it clear a number of times that there are several hundred officers within the ranks of the Metropolitan Police that he would gladly get rid of if he could.
And Martin, just returning to the victims in this case, the women that this man so brutally hurt over the years, I mean, is there a prospect, has there been any word that more may come forward? Yes.
I interviewed the investigating officer from Hertfordshire Police. Hertfordshire because Carrick lived in Stevenage and some of his victims did. He said that, yes, after their appeals that followed Carrick's guilty pleas, when the whole Carrick story emerged, they made appeals for more victims to come forward, and yes, some have. They are being interviewed, their complaints, their allegations are being investigated. He wouldn't go into how many. Perhaps he might be prepared to say more today. Let's wait and see. But certainly there are more potential victims making allegations against Carrick, and I think it's almost inevitable that there will be more charges.
And if you're just joining us on Sky, just a reminder that we're bringing you the news that the former Metropolitan Police officer David Carrick is going to serve at least 30 years behind bars for attacking a dozen women over a 17-year period. A two-day sentencing at Southwark Crown Court has heard how he used his power and control to carry out a catalogue of violent and brutal sex attacks. We're just staying with Martin Brunt, our crime correspondent, because we're expecting to hear from the police and the CPS. Do they have questions to answer here, Martin?
Sorry, I missed that. I think you said the police have questions to answer. Yes, I think one of the difficulties, I think, in getting answers to those questions today is that the whole Carrick case is now going to be part of an independent inquiry that's been going on into the murder of Sarah Everard by Wayne Couzens, serving Metropolitan Police officer as he was at the time. The Carrick case is being added to that inquiry, and it may be that those that we want to talk in detail about what went wrong in the Carrick case, they may decide that that's going to be examined very obviously and very publicly, and they may be reluctant, I think, to go into the kind of details about the problems that weren't overcome in the Carrick investigation. Certainly when I spoke to the senior investigating officer last week, he was very reluctant to go into the mistakes that were made over many years. So the allegations that were made and investigated by not just the Metropolitan Police but by Hertfordshire Police and Hampshire Police, and I think Sussex Police that heard some of those allegations, they weren't pursued for a number of reasons. In the past, the investigators in this case have said that there was a particular case where a woman claimed that Carrick had raped her and then withdrew her complaint and made the point that it's very difficult in those circumstances to pursue an allegation where it's simply a case of the word of the victim against the word of the suspect. But, perhaps there should be ways of exploring the pursuit of such crimes without the backing of the victim. But I do understand that that does present evidential problems, and I'm sure the prosecutors will tell us, as they often do, that you do have to reach a threshold of evidence that will convince a jury. Without the evidence of a woman who says she was raped, then that does present a problem.
Thank you, Martin. We're just getting word from the Metropolitan Police of a serving police officer who's just been charged with rape. PC Jordan Brown, attached to the Central East Command Unit, charged by postal requisition on Friday the 6th of January with rape and 3 counts of actual bodily harm, alleged to have occurred off duty, reported to police back in 2019, and an investigation was launched. He is now, though, suspended from duty. Does this perhaps suggest to you, Martin, one of these cases that we have been talking about, cases that are being re-examined by the police?
Yes, I don't know whether that particular case springs from the recent start of the re-examination. I think this is probably an investigation that's been going on for some time, if they've already got to the stage of charging that officer. I imagine it goes back further than the initiative that's been started by Commissioner Sir Mark Rowley. I mean, unless I know more about the case, I can't really tell you, but I think it's an example of what we're going to hear much more of in the coming weeks and months, as the Metropolitan Police, but other forces too, turn over that stone. That was one of Mark Rowley's phrases. You don't know what you're going to find, but you are going to find evidence of some crimes that will inevitably lead to charges and court cases and lots of more bad publicity for the Metropolitan Police. But in launching his initiative, the Commissioner is, very conscious that, he is going to unearth and prompt an awful lot more of bad publicity against his force, but it's something that he's prepared to put up with. He says it's necessary to go through, what did he say, there's going to be an awful lot more pain.
And if you're just joining us, just a reminder that former Metropolitan Police Officer David Carrick has been sentenced to at least 30 years behind bars for attacking a dozen women over a 17-year period, 30 years and 239 days, 17 years of offending and 12 victims. Really horrific attacks on these victims. Our crime correspondent Martin Brunt is outside the court. Martin, there was quite a lot about psychological reports here and a revelation in the sentencing that he has tried to take his own life, but the judge saying that she believes she tried to do this because of shame rather than remorse. That will have affected the sentencing, won't it?
Yes, I mean, I didn't catch everything that she said, but she talked about how his defence have not argued that there have been any personality disorders or certainly no psychiatric mental health issues. She made the point that he had been sent to Rampton, the secure hospital, for assessment. He was seen by a consultant psychiatrist, maybe more, but the deduction of that psychiatrist was that he wasn't suffering from any mental disorder. She did refer to at least one suicide attempt, but she did very forcefully make the point that, and she said, you were driven to try to commit suicide from shame rather than any sense of remorse. We did hear yesterday from Carrick's defence barrister, who did say that Carrick had exhibited remorse. The judge was conscious of that and I think perhaps made some allowances for that, although she did go on to say that he had for a very long time denied that he committed any crimes, said at one point that he couldn't remember them, or that where he had had sex with his victims, it had been with their consent. So she was quite damning on what she thought of what he had said for such a long time. He did eventually plead guilty, but it took many, many months after being charged. She gave him some reduction in his sentence. She talked about 20% reduction for his guilty pleas. So he could have been looking at a rather much longer sentence than the minimum 30 years that she's given him, just over 30 years. But of course, that's the minimum sentence he'll have to serve, at which point, if he wants to apply for parole, he'll be able to do so. But of course, like all prisoners serving a life sentence, he will have to convince a parole board that he's safe to be released into the public. The parole board would have to decide if he presents at least a minimum, or at most a minimum risk, before he can be freed.
OK, Martin Brunt, our crime correspondent down there outside the Crown Court, thank you very much for the time being. Let's just bring you another piece of breaking news. In the last few minutes, the Foreign Secretary, James Cleverly, has been making a statement in the House of Commons about the Turkish earthquake. He has revealed to the House that 3 British nationals are missing. We know that the death toll is feared to be in the many, many thousands there, and many, many more injured. But James Cleverly stating that 3 British nationals are among those who are known to be missing so far. Now, some breaking news about another story that came out during the David Carrick sentencing. Surrey Police say that an incident at Epsom College in the early hours of Sunday morning. They've made a statement about this. This, of course, the discovery of head teacher Emma Patterson, who was found dead alongside her husband, George, and their 7-year-old daughter. It is now being treated as a homicide investigation, a murder investigation. Milena Veselinovic is in the newsroom for us. What can you tell us, Milena?
That's right. Surrey Police just confirming that it is now being treated as a murder investigation. They say that they were called, the ambulance service was called at 1:10 and the police found 3 bodies, which they're confident are those of Emma Patterson, her 7-year-old daughter Letty and George Patterson. On site, there was also a firearm that was recovered. However, the police say they have to wait for the completion of the post-mortems later on this week before they can be confident to say what the cause of the death was. However, that firearm, they now say, was registered to George Patterson. The police also say that they had been in contact with him just days before this incident on the 2nd of February about this firearm. However, that was purely routine, and they are confident that no one else is involved in this tragic incident for now.
OK, Milena, thank you very much. Pretty grim morning for news, isn't it? The breaking news this hour that David Carrick sentenced to 30 years, 239 days in prison for a catalogue of abuse over a long period of years and over a large number of women. Also bringing you the latest at 1 o'clock on the earthquake in Turkey and Syria. 3 British nationals now confirmed to be missing there. Stay with Sky News. Good afternoon. You're watching Sky News at 1. Coming up this afternoon, breaking news. Former police officer David Carrick is sentenced to 30 years in prison after admitting a catalogue of violent sexual crimes, including rape.
The minimum term you will have to serve before the parole board can think of releasing you is 30 years, 239 days. And you may go down.
We will have the latest live from Southwark Crown Court.
Also coming up live for you from Lufa in Turkey this afternoon. Remarkable pictures emerge of a small child being rescued against the odds from underneath the rubble. In Syria, a young boy is saved after being dug out of the wreckage of a collapsed building by the white helmets. Here in Turkey, an anxious wait for many people as they try to find out what's happened to their loved ones. There's devastation in both countries as further aftershocks follow this 7.8 magnitude quake, hampering rescue efforts.
With helmets and
Painstaking work in freezing conditions. This is a scene in Gaziantep as teams pick through tangles of metal and concrete from thousands of flattened buildings.
Hi, good afternoon. The former Metropolitan Police officer David Carrick has been jailed for life with a minimum term of 30 years for dozens of sex offences. Carrick had admitted 49 sex offences, including dozens of rapes against 12 victims, carried out over a 17-year period. The sentencing judge, Mrs Justice Chima Grubb, said it was a spectacular downfall for a man charged with upholding the law.
5 life sentences are imposed on the second indictment on counts 1, 2, 3, 4 and 5. This makes a total of 36 life sentences. The minimum term you will have to serve before the parole board can think of releasing you is 30 years, 239 days. And you may go down.
Well, our crime correspondent, Martin Brunt, is at Southwark Crown Court. And Martin, this is a substantial sentence, isn't it?
It is not unexpected because he is one of the most prolific sex offenders we've ever seen in court in the UK. The judge, early on in her sentencing remarks, ruled out the possibility of jailing him for the rest of his life. But as his own barrister pointed out yesterday, the long sentence that he expected might effectively mean that he will never be released. And even though he has been given the chance of asking for parole, it would still be up to the parole board to determine whether he was safe to be released. And that might not be an easy hurdle for him to overcome. The judge said that he had taken monstrous advantage of women behind an appearance of propriety and trustworthiness. She talked about his campaign of crimes as bold and relentless, trusting that no victim would overcome her shame and fear to report him. And that was very much the theme of the judge's remarks. The aggravating factor, one of a number of aggravating factors, but the overarching aggravating factor was that if not directly, he had indirectly used his status as a police officer to instill fear and intimidate his victims, broadly by telling them that if they were to report his attacks on them, they wouldn't be believed because he was a police officer and his word would count for much more than theirs. Now, a lot of his victims fell for that. They believe that, and that explained why they didn't report him. But there was an extraordinary statement from one of his victims yesterday in court who said that she, and perhaps she, suffered some of the worst of his behaviour. She'd been taken back to his apartment, as it was then. He put a gun to her head, he raped her. He then put his hands around her throat. He raped her a number of times after that, left her bruised and bleeding with bite marks on her. And then she said she went to an A&E department at South London Hospital. And when she told a nurse that she had been raped by a police officer, the nurse told her to be careful, implied that she should be careful about reporting what had happened and who had raped her, suggesting to her, according to the victim, that she was young and she should probably get on with her life and forget about it because an allegation against a police officer was unlikely to go to court.
Martin, thank you very much. And we are expecting to get a statement from the police involved in this case and the Crown Prosecution Service also in a short time outside Southwark Magistrates Court, and we will return to it when we do.
Jane, you join us at, I think, what might be the worst possible news from the scene here in Urfa, where we have been all day. The workers here have been doing everything they possibly can to try to find 35 people who were trapped underneath the wreckage of this 7-storey building when it collapsed in the early hours of yesterday morning after the 7.8 magnitude earthquake devastated this building. All the buildings around it are deemed unsafe to live in, but it was this one that completely collapsed, pancaking down and trapping those 35 people beneath it, amongst them 2 children. Throughout the morning, the diggers have been gingerly scraping away at the detritus and careful not really to disturb the pile too much, anxious that one wrong move could see the building collapse still further. Rescue workers, if you were with us earlier, you'll know they occasionally paused to listen, to call out a name, maybe to hear a cry for help. Nothing. And then they continued. Residents who lived in the building have been stood around the area throughout the day, hoping against hope that their loved ones would be brought out from beneath this rubble. We've just seen 2 blankets taken to cover that area. There was a lot of excitement to start with. That has now ebbed away, and there is serious concern that those that are going to be brought out of this pile of rubble, sadly, will have breathed their last while trapped under the rubble. We believe it's 2 together. We know that there's some parents who have been hoping that their children would be brought out alive. They have been taken away within the last half an hour or so. Fearing the worst, I'm sure, but there are still 30-odd people still underneath this rubble, and who knows? You know, it may be good news, but given that there are blankets hiding the entrance and exit of that gap that's been dug really over the last, I don't know, hour or so, I fear it is not good news. It's the first earthquake here yesterday morning, about 4 o'clock in the morning, had a magnitude of 7.8. It struck at 17 minutes past 4. That was Turkish time, about 20 miles from the city of Gaziantep, close to Turkey's border with Syria. In the direct aftermath, there were dozens of aftershocks, and then 9 hours later, 24 minutes past 1 in the afternoon, a second huge quake measuring 7.5 was recorded at Pazarchuk in the province of Kalmarans. The worst affected areas were along the East Anatolian fault line. Within the last hour, the Foreign Secretary has been making a statement in the Commons. James Cleverly said there were concerns for 3 British nationals in the region.
As of this morning, we know that 3 British nationals are missing, and the Foreign Office's Crisis Response Hub is working to support the at least 35 British nationals who have been directly affected by these earthquakes. And we assess that the likelihood of large-scale British casualties remains low. We will continue to stand by the people of Turkey and Syria. We will deliver aid to those in need wherever they are, and we will do so. And as we do so, we will work with our allies and partners around the world to ensure the most effective humanitarian response.
Here the work's been going on hour after hours. These workers covered in the white dust from the rubble. It's absolutely freezing, and the locals have been building fires actually on the pavements here, Jane, to try to protect themselves and their neighbours from the bitterly cold weather. They don't want to leave while there is still hope that those trapped beneath this wreckage could still be found. alive. Let's get the very latest from Tom Clark, a warning that some viewers may find images in his report distressing.
Thank God you're safe, a rescuer in northern Syria says to a little girl trapped in broken concrete, too terrified to speak. Soon after, she's freed. A moment of triumph, one that's being repeated across this demolished landscape. But this is a disaster so vast in scale and temperatures so cold that moments like this will become less frequent as time passes. Concern is high for Syria, where rescuers must do their best in towns scarred by a decade of war, already crumbling and poorly resourced. Officials estimate more than 1,500 have died so far. In Turkey, the number of casualties is rising too.
Toplamda 3.419.
The Turkish vice president confirming nearly 3,500 citizens had died and more than 20,000 are injured. 8,000 had been rescued from rubble, he said, and nearly 6,000 buildings had collapsed. The extent of destruction caused by Monday's earthquakes is still unclear. The World Health Organization estimates 23 million people, including 1.4 million children, are likely affected, and the death toll could reach 20,000.
We all stand with you in this moment of unspeakable grief. This is a moment when we must come together in solidarity as one humanity.
Many buildings clearly survived the two enormous earthquakes and hundreds of aftershocks, but thousands of older or poorly constructed buildings collapsed, others pulverised. Some casualties have been taken on military planes for treatment in Istanbul. As they come in, hundreds of volunteers wait to go out. Offers of help are coming from around the world. Here,